Everyone, welcome to my Photography Masterclass. It's been a while, trying to get back to a regular schedule after Max, and we had a company-wide day off last week, and hopefully we can keep these going for the next few weeks at least until the end of the month with the Thanksgiving holiday. We probably won't do it that Friday, but welcome everyone. This is the pre-stream for my masterclass where I get on a few minutes before the main event, and I give maybe one or two tips for my people watching on my channel. But keep in mind that this will be after I do the pre-stream. That will be at b.net/Adobe Live. That's where I'll really be paying attention to the chat the most. But welcome everyone. Glad you could be here. Let's go ahead and dive into this quick tip. So I'm going to switch over to my desktop. And I've got Lightroom open now on my desktop. Here, let me get out of that. There we go. Lightroom now open on my desktop. This is Lightroom Classic. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between Lightroom and Lightroom Classic. But for my Lightroom Classic users, here's a quick tip. First and foremost, this tip actually, or the idea for this tip actually came from a user that asked me a question. They were like, hey, once my photos have been in Lightroom Classic for a while and I go to a folder I haven't been to in a while, I noticed that maybe some of the icons are grayed out, especially if the drive's not connected. In other words, they're offline, the drive's not plugged in, the previews have expired, because, just to save space, they only stay around if you're using them. And it's like, how can I not have that happen? How can I have previews that are always there or always be able to see my images? Now, there is one way around that, that you can select all the images that you care about, the ones you always want to be able to work on, even offline, and you go to your library menu and you go to previews and you say, build smart previews. Because if you build any of these other ones, they'll work. Standard previews, one-to-one previews, they'll work fine. But what will happen is after a while, they will get discarded just because if you don't look at those images in a while, they will go away. Not the images, the previews will go away and you'll be back to where you were. But if you build smart previews, they don't go away. The only problem is they take up a little more space, a little more, and they do stay with the catalog. So even if you unplug the drive, you'll still be able to access, not only see the thumbnails, but you'll even be able to edit those images in Lightroom, even if the drive's not connected, because that's what smart previews are for. So building smart previews, it was pretty quick because these were already built, because I always want to be able to access my portfolios, even if my images are not connected, like if I'm on my laptop and I'm out and about. Now, the other question that he asked after I said that is, well, will smart previews survive an optimized catalog? So if you optimize your catalog to kind of get rid of old things or clean the catalog up, will those smart previews stick around? And the answer is yes. Smart previews do survive an optimized catalog, but one-to-one and minimal previews do not if they're old. Like, in other words, you haven't looked at that folder or that collection in months, those previews will just delete themselves because they're like, oh, you're not even looking at these images. The images are still there. Don't worry, you don't have to worry about that. But the previews themselves may go away until you click on those images again with the drive connected and it rebuilds the previews. So let's say the drive's connected. You go to that folder and they're all grayed out. Well, you'll start to see them come in one by one because what Lightroom will do is rebuild those previews. So that's what happens. Over time, if you don't look at a folder or look at a collection after a while, it saves space by discarding previews you just aren't using. If you go back to that folder and the drive's connected, it will rebuild them. You go back to that folder and you use smart previews, they will be there. All right, we're going to kick things off with the regular stream in about 8 seconds. See you then. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Happy Masterclass Friday here on Adobe Live. My name is Terry White, Worldwide Design and Photography Evangelist, and it's my pleasure to be streaming to you once again on a Friday morning here in the lovely Atlanta area. And hopefully you guys are safe and you're happy and you're somewhere cool and you're doing cool things with photography. And you're here to learn more about your photography, at least in terms of editing and storage and optimizing and so forth and so on. So for those of you who are new, welcome. We're doing this mainly on Behance. So b.net/Adobe Live. If you happen to be watching this on one of my other channels, whether it's YouTube or you're watching on the Creative Cloud YouTube channel, you're watching it somewhere else, just note that I may not see your question or I may not see your comment because I'm looking mainly at this one chat window where I see Sean and General Kenobi and Fred and Mirko and Garrett and Julie and Steve and Valentine and Carol and Mike. So that's who I see in the chat right now because that's the one I'm going to be focused on, including the one and only Jason Levine. Beetlejuice is in the house. Jason Levine will be doing a masterclass a little bit later today on something probably audio and probably video or one or the other. And Jason is our video audio expert and musician. So if you're into anything that moves on your computer, check out Jason's masterclass later today. All right, so with that said, head over to b.net/Adobe Live if you want me to see your comment like the one that just came in from Revert Mike. All right, so what are we doing today? Today we're going to be talking about a topic that I can't believe I haven't covered. Like I was looking for a topic to cover for this one, and I get a lot of questions about on my last Adobe live stream last week where I was hosting Andre. A lot of people were asking differences between Lightroom and Classic and which one do I use and so forth and so on. I was like, have I ever done a stream on the differences, just dedicated to the differences between those two versions? And I went back, I said, sure I have. I went back and looked at every single masterclass twice, and I had not done it yet. So that's what we're doing today. So I'll get into a quick overview of what the two applications are all about, especially for people that are new. And then we'll get into maybe some presentation demo and all that so you guys can actually see and ask questions and so forth and so on. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive over to my computer where I'm going to go ahead and show you what I mean by a quick overview. All right, so I'm going to head over to my computer. I put together this deck to just go over what is Lightroom and what is Lightroom Classic. And more importantly, at the end of the day, or the end of this hour, and 51 minutes or less, we will answer the question, which one is right for you? And that's really what this is all about. Because you could certainly make a case for either one, depending on who you are and what you do. They're both great. It's not like one is here to replace necessarily the other one. It's really, they end up being, for the most part, for two different types of customers, for two different types of photographers. And that's what we're going to really be covering today. So Jacqueline, I see you over there in Detroit. She will know what this means. Anyway, that's an inside joke. Anyway, let's go ahead and dive right in. So, first and foremost, Lightroom and Lightroom Classic fight, yes. First and foremost, what is Lightroom? Actually, the technical name was originally Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. We don't really call it, and that is still the technical name, but you don't really hear people use the full name, or as some like to say, the government name when we call it. We just usually say Lightroom. So, but the original name, and still the technical legal name to this day, is Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. And actually we'll get into all the names in a minute, but it was first released way back in 2007, and that seems like a lifetime ago. What is that? 13 years ago, if my math is correct, going on almost 14 years. And I was all the way back in the day one of using Lightroom, even before it was released as a public beta. It was actually one of Adobe's biggest and best public beta releases because we really wanted photographers to weigh in on what this new tool was going to be for. And you might think, well, why 2007? Why did Adobe come out with Lightroom back then? Because it was originally designed as a alternative to Bridge. because Bridge was becoming all things to all people, graphic designers, photographers, people that just wanted to manage their files or file browsing, video, all of that. And photographers needed a little more dedication. In other words, something that was specifically for photography. Now, there are still people to this day that just use Bridge and maybe Bridge in Photoshop. Okay, I'm not going to fault you for that. You're using one of our products or two of our products. Great on you. But if you're really, unless you're really like, I'm happy, everything works perfectly, and I know exactly what I'm doing, you should really take a look at one of these two versions of Lightroom. All right, so now, around 2015, where we introduced Creative Cloud in 2013, everything got renamed with CC on the end of it. So we introduced Adobe Photoshop Lightroom CC, the name keeps getting longer. And of course, with every new version, it got new features. And this was also starting to pivot from Lightroom being available as a shrink wrap application and cloud to just it being available as a cloud application. So the last shrink wrap version or the last perpetual license version was Lightroom 6. So Lightroom 1 back in 2007, all the way to Lightroom 6 around this time. And then, Lightroom 6 basically got discontinued, meaning we didn't update the perpetual version anymore. And if you wanted to keep going, you went with Lightroom CC. All right. And then as the internet started to continue and people started really getting into their mobile devices, this opened the door for Lightroom Mobile, which is what we call basically being able to use Lightroom on a mobile device. Started with the iPad, actually. And then phone, and then web and Android, and eventually even Apple TV. So a lot of people don't know that if you have an Apple TV, you can actually go download the Lightroom app for free on your Apple TV and use Lightroom to view your images or view slideshows even on your TV natively on Apple TV. You don't have to project it from your phone or do anything. It's actually a native app. And another thing that people overlook a lot is that there's a web version of Lightroom, literally in a web browser, no application required. You go to a internet cafe if they still exist. You go to a friend's house, you get on a web browser and you go to lightroom.adobe.com and you can actually log in to your Lightroom and see and edit your images and export them out and do everything you would, well, not everything, but do a lot of the things you would do on the actual device that ran Lightroom application. So, this is where Lightroom really started to take off from being untethered to the desktop, from the desktop to being available pretty much in your pocket, in your backpack, in your, wherever you went, or even just watching your images on the TV. All right. In 2017, this is where it really gets confusing. Adobe Photoshop Lightroom CC was introduced. And you're thinking, well, wait, didn't we already have that? This is a whole new Lightroom, not an update to Lightroom that had been gone from 1 to 6 and then Lightroom CC. This is a brand new, different application from the ground up, not like pieces, just completely rewritten from the ground up to be a whole new Lightroom. And we get into the why. Because this actually caused a lot of fear from people that are classic users, which we call them classic users now, but the previous version of Lightroom, that, oh my God, they're going to replace or disband or stop supporting the Lightroom I know and love. And that, of course, did not happen. This was 3 years ago already, going on 4 years. And you still have access to both versions, and both versions are still getting updated. And I'll let you know as a software guy that when you still see software getting updated, I mean with features, I don't mean just bug fixes and security updates, I mean new features. That means that there's a development team working on it. When there are no new features ever, that means there is no development team working on it, and that application is probably end of life soon, or it's not going to be around much longer. So the fact that Lightroom Classic still gets new features, not just fixes, that means that someone's working on it. Someone's actively doing things with it. All right. The Lightroom doesn't seem to work. Can you please share it at the end? Share what at the end? The online link, lightroom.adobe.com. That's the link. So lightroom.adobe.com. Nothing else, not a www in front of it. That's the link. And I think Tim put it in the chat already. All right. And you probably, like that may not work on mobile devices. So that's mainly for people on a desktop, because if you're on a mobile device, you would just download the app. Okay, so then that caused this. And this is where it really, really, really got confusing. Because now we have two versions. And they were originally called these names: Adobe Photoshop Lightroom Classic CC and Adobe Photoshop Lightroom CC. Imagine, as an evangelist, trying to explain all of this in 5 seconds to an audience. And it because the names were both called Lightroom, and that's what we just, you don't call someone their full name, full first, middle, and last name every time you see them. You call them by their first name. So when we call Lightroom, like, well, which one now are you talking about? And that's the problem. So, yeah. I'm not. Those are decisions above my pay grade that I'm not going to get into. All right, but anyway, here's what they look like. So this is Lightroom Classic today. I just took the screenshot like yesterday. So this is what it looks like. As you can see, you have your side panels, one on the left side, one on the right side. On the left side is all about management of your photos, what folders they're in, what collections you put them in for organization, managing the storage, managing your photos, deleting photos. That's all happens on the left side of the library module. On the right side of the library module is all about metadata. So for doing keywords, for seeing where a photo was taken, for changing the name of your photo, for doing all of that stuff happens on the right-hand side. And then, of course, you have your thumbnails in the middle. And you can go bigger, full screen on an image and all that. And the top right-hand corner is probably the biggest difference, is that they're modules. There's a library module, a develop module, a map module, a book module, a slideshow module, a print module, and even a web module that most people probably aren't using these days because it's kind of dated. But anyway, all of the other modules that most people are probably still at some point using one or the other, or a few. Maybe you don't use map, but you use book. Maybe you don't use slideshow, but you use print. So at some point, depending on who you are, you're probably using some of those other modules besides library and develop. Okay, this is the new one. This is just Lightroom, not Classic. This is Lightroom. So, and from here on out, you're either going to hear me refer to it as Lightroom or Lightroom Classic. So that's how I'm going to be doing it from this day forward, is that I'm not going to try and call it Lightroom Cloud or Lightroom Mobile or any of those things. It's Lightroom. Or I'm talking about Lightroom Classic. That's it. Those are the names. So if you don't hear me put Classic on the end of it, then I'm speaking about this one. All right, so what you see here is you see the same kind of thing on the left-hand side. You see organization, basically just organization. You see albums, you see folders of albums, and that's it. There are no folders of images on your hard drive, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. And on the right-hand side, there are panels that pop out, but there's no modules in the upper right-hand corner. There's no library, print, develop, all of that. You're either looking at your images, organizing your images on the left-hand side, or editing your images with the panels that pop out on the right-hand side, and that's it. That's what this version's all about. Now we'll get into, again, the differences in just a moment. Okay, so this is, and sorry, my Lightroom CCs moved it, but they're going to go away in a minute anyway. So until about a year ago, they were, I got to fix this, it's driving me crazy. Hang on. There we go. Stuff moved when I brought this from my laptop to this computer. Anyway, so Lightroom Classic CC and Lightroom CC, we don't call them that anymore because we dropped the CC off all of our product names. So now it's just Lightroom Classic, even though it's technically Photoshop Lightroom Classic and Photoshop Lightroom, but it's pretty much Lightroom Classic and Lightroom. That's really what it's about today. And the icons weren't really helping either, because it was an LR with a square around it and an LR with rounded corners around it. There was a slightly different color. And just for a history standpoint, The rounded corner meant back then that whatever app it was, so if it was Photoshop with rounded corners, if it was Lightroom with rounded corners, it meant that that application had a mobile component. So in other words, this square application did not have a mobile equivalent. It did not have a mobile app that was the exact equivalent of it. It just was square, like InDesign, for example, was square back then, and because there was no mobile component to it, still isn't. And Lightroom had the rounded corners. But that all changed because now we made the icons the same colors. They're both rounded corners now. Everything's rounded corners. But now it's pretty clear to see which one's which. Lightroom Classic has the C and Lightroom does not. So that makes it even easier. You don't have to worry about, oh, I can't really, maybe I'm colorblind. I can't see the colors. Can't really see if it's rounded corners or not. Now it's pretty clear to see which one's which. Okay. Both versions have a lot of overlap, as you might expect. And in a nutshell, they both allow you to import, organize, edit, and share your photos, which is what people do day to day. So if they both do that, then what's the real difference between them? Like if they both do the overall job that a photographer needs to do, why would I pick one or the other? And let's get into that now. All right, let's start with Lightroom Classic. Lightroom Classic, same Lightroom that if you're not new to this, that you've used since 2007 or somewhere in between. So the same one you've used for years. It still gets new features and performance updates. It got a new update as of October this year for the Max update, just like the other one did. So it's still getting new features. It's still getting new things that it can do. You can still sync an unlimited number of smart previews to the cloud. So this is a nice benefit because it doesn't cost you anything extra to do this. And we'll get into what that really means in a moment. But when Lightroom Mobile first came out, meaning a Lightroom version for the phone, and all you had was Lightroom, which is now Classic, on the desktop, how would you get those images onto your phone? Well, you could sync smart previews to the cloud. And that's how you got them on your phone back then, and still to this day. And that's still unlimited. You don't have to pay extra for that. That's just a part of Lightroom Classic. All right, but here's the biggest thing. And this is really what separates the two the most. You're responsible for storing and backing up. Meaning that if your hard drive or my hard drive crashed today and I didn't have a backup and I lost all my photos, there really is no reason for me to call Adobe at that point, because Adobe will be, feel sorry for me and we'll cry together, but there's nothing Adobe can do at that point because I'm responsible for where I store and back up my originals. So if I don't have a good backup strategy, if I'm not good at that, then I might not be the person that should be using Lightroom Classic, because if a catastrophe happens, then I might lose years of work. I might use images that can't be replaced. So keep that in mind, but that is one of the biggest reasons why you would think about one or the other. Either you're good at that or you're not. And if you're not, then you might be thinking about it. It might be time to think about the other one. All right, so what's Lightroom? New. Yeah, it's only been out for a few years. Easier to use because there's less things that it does. So it pretty much does the basic job of managing, editing, and importing and sharing and managing your photos. Import and edit your photos everywhere, because even though those mobile versions like for iPad, Android, iPhone came out back, 2020 has been renamed the catastrophe, back when all we had was Lightroom, what we call Classic now, this version is actually a derivative of what's on your phone. So if you think about it this way, we had Lightroom Classic or Lightroom, which is now Classic. We came out with a phone and tablet version and a web version, and they did some syncing. But if you were to say, okay, now I'm going to start from scratch and build a Lightroom that works on desktop and mobile, it would probably look the same, probably have as many of the same features as possible. And that would be your goal, is that you could work on it no matter what device you had in your hand. So whether I'm on my tablet or my phone or my desktop, that Lightroom is the same. Same look, same feel, same features for the most part, and more importantly, syncing, and we'll get into that in a minute, syncing originals back and forth. The other thing is that this one, since it is tied to syncing to the cloud, there's no keywording required. You can still keyword if you want to, like you can put keywords in that no one else would know. But Adobe Sensei is looking at the type of images you're uploading or syncing and saying, oh, that looks like a mountain. I know what a mountain looks like. That looks like a tree. I know what a tree looks like. That looks like a waterfall. I know what a waterfall looks like. So if you search for any of those terms, I'm going to bring up your images automatically because I know what those things are. So even if I didn't put any of those keywords in ever, it would know what those images are and bring them up for me. Okay, next up. And this is the big one, just like the other big one was in red on the other side. All of your images, not just a few, not just the ones you decide, all of your images are backed up to the cloud. All of your images are backed up to the cloud. So if you import JPEGs, they're backed up. If you import RAW files, DNGs, camera or your native camera RAW files, CR2s, NEFs, whatever your camera shoots, they're backed up the minute you add them to Lightroom. So, and of course the time it takes to do it. But once they're synced, they are backed up. So now let's talk about that catastrophe, not 2020, the other one. Let's say your hard drive crashed and you still don't have to call Adobe because all you'd have to do is get a new hard drive, computer, whatever you would need, and then download Lightroom and sign in, and all your images start coming down again, or they're available to you again. So that's for the person that says, I'm not good at all that management stuff. I just want to work on my photos and shoot. Then maybe this one's for you, because that part of it is solved by Adobe, meaning you don't have to worry about backing up. You don't have to worry about keep buying hard drives. You don't have to do any of that. Your images are stored. Yes, high res, the full resolution, not just smart previews, the full resolution. So that's what I meant by yes, your JPEGs, yes, your RAW files. There's no difference in, well, if I upload a JPEG with Lightroom, it's going to be a smaller JPEG or it won't be the full RAW. No, it's the full size of your image. So if it's a 48 megapixel file, it's going to be backing up a 48 megapixel file. There's no difference in quality whatsoever because it is backing up the originals. So yes. Aha. Okay, so I'm starting to get the differences now. All right, next up. And of course, you can choose either one. There are 3 monthly plans to choose from. I don't know if there's still 3, but there were 3, started at $9.99 a month. So the price hasn't changed. You now decide which one you want. Okay, now let's talk about Lightroom Classic and Lightroom in terms of cloud. Okay, both talk to the cloud. The original Lightroom always did. The minute we introduced the cloud, it always talked to it. And all images in Lightroom Classic, and then sync the top images to Lightroom. Okay, we're going to get into workflows like that and talk about should you or shouldn't you. But anyway, yeah, it's possible. Anyway, Lightroom Classic does talk to the cloud. It always did. So the minute we introduced the cloud, even before there was a Lightroom, meaning back when it was just, anyway, before there was a new Lightroom, we synced smart previews. Now, smart previews, so where the person that said full resolution, are not full resolution. They're 2540 pixels, so 2540 pixels on the longest edge, so tall or wide, depending on your photo. It's only going to be that size, ever. Like, it will never be bigger than that, and never's a long time, but most likely smart previews won't ever be bigger than that. That is the size of smart previews, but they're limited. And if you have just a standard plan that you've always had, you can still sync 20 gigabytes worth of originals because your plan includes 20 and maybe 100 now, but it was 20. It was 20 for years, and I can't remember if we upped it to 100. But either 20 or 100 gigabytes of originals, as it always was. Now, what if I go and take a picture with Lightroom on my phone? Because Lightroom on my phone has a camera. And let's say my phone, which it can, shoot a 12 megapixel RAW file in Lightroom. It can do that. Does a smart preview come down to my desktop? No. Originals come down. So if you're shooting with your phone, even on Lightroom Classic, that's all you have, you're going to get whatever resolution your phone shoots in whatever format you shot it in down to Lightroom on your Lightroom Classic on your desktop. So unlimited smart previews up, or 20 gigabytes, maybe 100, depending on your plan, up of originals, and all originals down. So if you import an original somewhere else on your phone or your iPad or whatever, those originals are going to come down back into Classic. But keep in mind, those originals, until you remove them from the cloud, are still going to tie up that space for originals, that 20 or 100 gigs, depending on whatever it is. Okay, what's the other one? Lightroom. Lightroom starts at 1 terabyte of originals up and down. There's no smart preview concept in Lightroom at all. It's originals. It's full resolution no matter what. There's no such thing as smart previews in terms of just using Lightroom. So the plan starts at 1 terabyte. What if you use more than that? Then you have to buy more space. And if you need 2 terabytes, now you're paying $9.99 twice. You're using $20 a month. You need 5 terabytes, 10 terabytes, you're going to keep bumping it up. And we're going to get into it again, depending on, that may be enough for you, it may not be enough for you, depending on who you are. Okay. What about the web and mobile? Originals up. So if I go to my web browser today on your computer, if you let me in your house and I go to your web browser on your computer, I log into my Lightroom and I put in a thumb drive and I upload a 30 megapixel file, well, that original is going to go up on my web browser. Or if I shoot with my phone or my iPad, that original is going to go up, as I mentioned. And of course, any resolution down. So it depends on whatever it is. If it came from Classic, it's going to be a smart preview that's going to come down into your phone. If it were an original, it's going to be an original that comes down to your phone. It just depends on what it started out as. All right, merging images for panorama or HDR isn't possible in Lightroom. Sure it is. It's not possible in Lightroom on mobile, but it's definitely possible in Lightroom on desktop. So that, George, that if you meant mobile, no. But if you mean desktop, it absolutely can do both. All right, next. And so Lightroom is on your desktop, Lightroom's in your web browser. Lightroom on mobile devices means your photos are literally everywhere, no matter which plan you use. It just depends on how you manage it. Okay, now we get into the important part of this. Which one is for you? And I can't answer that. I can only give you the facts and you'll have to decide. But let's talk about that. So this is my visual indication of which one might be for you. Depends on what kind of person you are. If you like it simple, quick, one button, it just does what I need, then maybe you want Lightroom. But if you're into all the features, I can manage it, I can handle it, I can do everything I need, then maybe Lightroom Classic's for you. It really depends on you. All right. There's also a difference in terminology. And this also, it used to bug me at first, but then I kind of understood why the team did it this way. Why is there a difference in terminology? For example, in Lightroom Classic for, last 13 years, it's always been import. But now with the new one, it's not import, it's called add photos. And I think about it in terms of if you were setting out, let's say Lightroom Classic never existed, and you were setting out today in 2020, or let's say 2021, let's get past this year. You're setting out in 2021 to build a brand new product from the ground up. You'd probably use easier terminology. So it would appeal to everyone. So yeah, Lightroom is add photos versus import. Now in Lightroom Classic, you have catalogs. You can have one, you can have more than one. I use one now, but back in the day, I used to have 3 or 4. And there's no concept of catalogs in Lightroom. It's all your photos are in one thing. There's no start a new catalog or start a new thing. Nope, they're all in one thing. So there's no equivalent to catalogs. Folders gets confusing because in Lightroom Classic, the folders are really the same folders that are on your operating system. So if you have a pictures folder, and in your pictures folder, you have a Japan folder, and in your Japan folder, you have a Tokyo folder, and you put images in it. Those are the same folders that Lightroom Classic sees. There's no equivalent of that in Lightroom because you're not managing folders on your hard drive. You're just adding your photos and putting and organizing them in what are called albums. So there's no concept of folders, but there is a concept of what we call collections in Lightroom Classic, or albums in Lightroom. So you create an album called Tokyo. You would put, you could put another album inside of that called, Waterfront. You could do whatever you want and organize your photos that way. So you decide however you want to use those albums, but there's no concept, or collections, but there's no concept of folders or catalogs in Lightroom. Now, there are collections, which are albums, and there's collection sets that we call a grouping of collections in Lightroom Classic. Well, unfortunately, the name they chose for that in Lightroom, which makes it confusing, is those are called folders. So in Lightroom, a folder is a folder of albums. In Lightroom Classic, a folder is where you keep your photos. And like I said, you're scratching your head at this point, but here's the way to think about not scratching your head. Chances are you're not going to ever be confused by this because you're going to be using one or the other. So you only have to learn yours. You don't have to worry about what the other one calls it because you're only using yours. So if you're only using Lightroom, you don't care that folders are called or something else on the other one because you're never using the other one. And same thing in Classic. If you're using collections, that's what you're used to. You're not worrying about albums and folders because your folders mean something else. So it really should be, it shouldn't be confusing. I'm showing you there are differences, but it's really whichever one you're in, that's what it's called. All right, there are differences even in the tool names. So for example, in Lightroom Classic for years, we've had a spot removal tool, but in Lightroom, they call that same tool the healing brush, similar to what we call it in Photoshop. I would argue that one because I think it's more of still a spot removal tool, but that's just me. In Lightroom Classic, it's called the radial or graduate. There are two tools, radial filter and graduated filter. Those same two tools in Lightroom are called the radial gradient or linear gradient. Again, they do the exact same thing, but they're just different names. And of course, in Lightroom Classic, you export your images out when you're ready to share them. And in Lightroom, you just share them. There is an export too, but it's under share. It's under the share menu. So again, if you put a blinder side on one side or the other, you're only having to worry about your terms. You don't have to, I'm the only one that has to keep them both up because I'm showing people both programs. But just keep in mind, it's one or the other. All right. Now, which one is right for you? Well, that depends on what kind of photography you are. And what I mean by that, not what you shoot, like portraits or landscapes or travel, not that, but meaning, are you a hobbyist or professional? Do you shoot with a DSLR or mainly your phone? Do you, or mirrorless? You know, it really gets in. Are you doing a lot of production? Like you're producing thousands of images every couple of days? Versus I go out every now and then I shoot some images. All of that really makes a difference as to which kind of person would probably fit one or the other. Are you good at organization and backup? If the answer is yes, then you're probably okay with Lightroom Classic. If the answer, if you look at your desk, you can never find anything. You look even in Lightroom, you can never find anything. Then you probably are not a good candidate for Lightroom Classic. You probably should start looking at Lightroom. How many images do you shoot a month? That's a really big one because whereas Lightroom Classic, you're storing your images on your hard drive and you can buy as many hard drives as you need. With Lightroom, you're storing your images in the cloud and you're paying for that amount of space. So if you shoot thousands of raw files a week and you're importing or adding them all to Lightroom, well, eventually you're going to fill up that 1 terabyte and you're going to have to buy more space. And so or you're going to start saying, well, I'm not going to add them all. I'm just going to add a few. so I can keep under the space, then you're really deciding that you're only using Lightroom partially or part-time, like, because then you have photos that aren't in it, and therefore you're defeating the purpose. So you really need to decide, if you shoot a ton, especially if you shoot a ton of raw files, Lightroom may not be for you, because you're going to outgrow the storage. It's going to start to get expensive after you start needing 5 or 10 terabytes of storage. And I think we only have a limit of so much. Like, even if you're willing to pay, I think we can only sell like 10 or maybe even 20 terabytes or whatever it is. There's a limit. So what happens when you hit that limit? Like, even if you're willing to pay for it. So again, depends on who you are. Do you shoot mostly RAW or JPEG? If you shoot mostly JPEG, you can probably get away with either one. But if you shoot mostly RAW and you shoot a lot of RAW, then it gets back to, you need to decide which one is better for you in terms of storage. All right. Advantages to one over the other. And someone brought up an advantage I hadn't really thought of. Jan said Lightroom doesn't include plugins, they're very useful. You're correct. Lightroom Classic has a plugin architecture. Third parties can write plugins to do all kinds of things. And that is not totally the case in Lightroom, meaning that there are just third-party plugins for just anything you want to do. But there are third-party export plugins, so meaning for printing and things like that. So you're absolutely right in terms of functionality. Classic has the advantage in plugins, but it's not totally true that Lightroom can't have a third party do something. All right, cost of storage. So Lightroom Classic, cost of storage is lower because you're storing the images on your hard drives. You're buying them once. You only add when you need more. You're not paying monthly for them, so forth and so on. Believe it or not, Lightroom Classic has an advantage for people that like to print. If you like to print, you can print out of Lightroom Classic. The printing is local. If you go under your file menu and choose print, there is no printing directly out of Lightroom. You can send it to a print provider, which there are some built into Lightroom, or you can export it out and then print from another program like Photoshop, but there is no file print. There is no Command P or Control P. It literally does not have a print command at all. Now, this is probably the biggest one for me, and this is one that'll keep me in Classic for at least until Lightroom has it, if it ever has it. And that's tethered shooting. Because I am a portrait photographer, and I do like to see my images as I'm taking them on a bigger screen, like my laptop or a computer or a monitor. I plug my mirrorless or my DSLR right into Lightroom and shoot directly into it. Lightroom Classic. Lightroom doesn't have that feature. So that alone will always keep me in Lightroom Classic, at least for the most part. And technically, Lightroom Classic has literally dozens, if not hundreds, more features overall than Lightroom. So, Lightroom, what's the advantages? Your images are backed up. Number one, they're like, the minute you add them and they sync, that's it. You don't have to worry about a catastrophe. Your images will always be available to you. Full resolution images everywhere, not just smart previews. So whether I add them on my phone or add them on my desktop or add them on my iPad, those full resolutions are in all of those places. And you don't have to manage that storage. You don't have to, oh my God, I'm filling up the drive. I need to buy another drive and then figure out how to get the images onto the new drive, or you don't have to do any of that because they're all syncing to the cloud. So as long as you have enough space in the cloud, you don't have to manage the space. And it's just an easier interface because it has less things to do, less things to worry about. So the interface itself and the terminology is easier for the beginner. All right, so this question keeps coming up. Nicholas is, why not both? At the end of the day, and this is I'm giving you the official Adobe recommendation. The official Adobe recommendation is pick one. Don't matter which one, don't care which one, but pick one. Because there is a difference in terms, let's say I'm smart, I know how to do this, I'm going to use both. I'm good, I know what I'm doing. Well, then you could probably get away with it. But there are differences, meaning, for example, we talked about keywords, or I talked about keywords earlier. Keywords don't sync between the two programs. So if you spend a lot of time, keywords is your thing, and you spend a lot of times in keywords in Lightroom Classic, those keywords aren't coming over to Lightroom when you sync them. some of the editing features are in Classic, but not in the other one. Like, for example, range mask is not in Lightroom. It's in Lightroom Classic, but it's not in Lightroom. So there are differences that could cause you issues down the line when you're thinking, hey, I edited this, and then you go over to the other program and it's not that way. Or I added these keywords and it's not that way. So that's why Adobe recommends picking one and going with one. Do I use two? Both of them? Yes, because I teach both of them. And I know the differences, and I know what's going to sync, and I know what's not going to sync, and I'm willing to make that or take that chance. But unless you are confident in your knowledge of both programs and what they do and don't do, Adobe's official recommendation is pick one or the other. All right, so Q&A. I think I got the questions that I saw. So I saw someone say, I print all my own photos, and I saw someone say, Walmart does all my printing. And I'm kind of the same way in both ways. Meaning I used to print all my photos, and now I don't. I don't own a photo printer at all anymore because it was just too much work for the infrequent number of times I printed photos. I spent more time getting the printer to warm up and getting the streaks not to be there and all of that, getting the ink flowing again, that it just drove me crazy. So I now send out all my work to be printed. All right, question. I like to edit first in Lightroom Classic, sync the collections in the cloud, and then see them in Lightroom. What goes up from Lightroom Classic? Full size? No. Lightroom Classic never syncs up full size. Period. Never, not any circumstance that Lightroom Classic syncs up a full size image. It only syncs up a smart preview. Period. So, got that question answered. All right. This session is very helpful. I'm a long-time Lightroom user and consequently a Lightroom Classic user. I never had a reasonable comprehensive comparison. I understand now the details. You're welcome. All right. Okay, now there's just people battling back and forth as to why you should do one or the other. Again, whatever works for you is great. What works for someone else might be different. Yep, I use Costco's Shannon as well. And all right, I'm not seeing a ton of questions, so I'm going to get into some showing. Top 10 images for Lightroom. Lightroom Classic for heavy production like print website. Okay, so Nicholas says top 10 images for Lightroom, and by that I mean iPhone, iPad, social media, and Lightroom Classic for production and print and website. And again, that's Nicholas using both. And again, that depends on you. All right. Okay, so let's get out of the slides and let's go in and look at some demo here. So first and foremost, what I meant by syncing and smart previews. So this is Lightroom Classic, and in Lightroom Classic, once you turn on, and now it's in the right-hand corner, once you turn on syncing, which mine is, now it says pause because it's on. Once you set that up, and here, let's do this. There we go. Once you set that up, then it won't do anything. It won't sync anything unless you go to a regular collection, not a smart collection. And these boxes will appear next to each collection, and you click the little sync icon in it, meaning you turn it on or turn it off, and those are the collections that will then sync up to the cloud, smart previews only. And those are the ones that will be available on your phone, on your iPad, on your Android device, on the web, in a smart preview resolution, 2540 on the longest edge. I can't stress that enough. All right, video production, which one? Classic, because it has more features for video than Lightroom does. So that's easy. All right, next up. So I've got these images. I have a portfolio dronography collection where these are the images I want in it. These are the ones that are going to sync. These are the ones I'm managing on my own, and they're only syncing up. The cloud, the Smart Preview version. Now, if I switch over to my iPad, which I'm going to hopefully wake it up. There we go. And I go over to Lightroom. I'll show you guys in a minute. Let me get over to it. Lightroom's loading photos. What's the future of Lightroom? I have the idea to use Lightroom in my iPad Pro with more functions. The future of Lightroom is bright, meaning that it has a future. It will continue to be developed and continue to add more stuff, just like the rest of our applications. What is the benefit of syncing smart previews to the cloud? So that you can use them on your mobile devices, number one. That's it. So that you can use them in other places. Hang on, my iPad's acting weird here. Let me do this. That is the benefit. There we go. Okay, so now let's go to that same album, because now I'm in Lightroom, so it's called an album. And where is it? There it is. All right, and let me show you guys what it looks like. Okay. Oh, hang on. Let me re-plug this in. There it is. Okay. So here's Lightroom on my iPad. So just to show you guys, I just went into my Adobe folder. I tapped on Lightroom. I went to the same album, and now the only thing that's different is they're sorted in a different order. So let's go ahead and sort them by custom order, just like they are on the desktop. And now they're in the same order as they were on my desktop as well. So these are all smart previews. So the person asked that question, why would I ever sync smart previews so that I can get to them over here or on another device? What chances of syncing Lightroom Classic Smart Collections in the future? Trevor, that's a good question. I've wanted that feature for a long time. So Trevor's question is, I made it very clear when I said, here, let me switch back over to the desktop. On the desktop, I said regular collections, meaning that you have this little checkbox in front of your regular collections. What you don't have, let me zoom back out. What you don't have is a checkbox in front of smart collections. So smart collections don't have a checkbox. They cannot be synced in Lightroom Classic. And by the way, there is no concept of smart albums in Lightroom. The answer is I've asked for it. I've been asking for it for years. For whatever reason, there's a technical challenge with doing that they just haven't done it yet. So I don't know that it will ever happen, but you're not the only one to want that. Any plans to abandon Classic, seeing how Adobe loves cloud apps? There are no plans that I'm aware of to abandon Classic. Yes, I need a beer, Terry. Gotta shoot. Okay, good. All right, so I just got rid of all those questions, or got those questions answered. Now, switching back to the iPad. Okay, so because I synced this album, or that collection, depending on where you were, so that collection, which became this album, and these are only smart previews, that doesn't matter. I can still go into this. I still have access to all my features. I can still see a decent resolution, decent quality of it. I can still go in and edit this and do whatever I want to do. So if I want to make it super, super dark or super, super bright, I could. Let's make it super, super dark and just get back out of it. Now, because I made that change on my iPad, and because whether it's a smart preview or an original, doesn't matter, because it's going to sync the metadata of that image everywhere else. So I just updated the image and the settings. Let's see if my syncing's happening here. Syncing in progress. Okay, so eventually that will make its way back to the desktop. If I go check my phone. Oh, I don't have to do it. It's already there. So if I go back to my desktop, there it is, the new darker version on my desktop. Now, the desktop, keep in mind, Lightroom Classic has the full resolution. So as long as this image is the drive's connected that has that image, it has, if we look over here, you see the word original, that is the original RAW, in this case, RAW file plus JPEG. So that's the original one that came out of the camera with my edits. And that edit that just happened on the iPad made its way back over to Lightroom Classic. So syncing from Lightroom Classic has always been for that benefit, to be able to see your images on another device, to be able to edit them on another device, so I can take my mobile devices with me and do all my edits, do all my culling, my picks, my rejects. I can just work on the couch. I can work on a train. I can do anything back in the days when I used to travel. You can do all those things and not take a computer with you. You could even do it on your phone. And whatever you did while you were out and about on your mobile device would make its way back over to your desktop and apply itself to your full resolution images that are on your hard drive. All right, so now if I go back into this one in Lightroom Classic and I go into my develop module and I go look at my exposure, which I can see it's way down now, and I just double click and reset it back to the way it was, and then I get out of that, guess what? That change is gonna sync up, not the image, just the little text change, because that's all metadata is, it's just text. And then that change will then be available everywhere else I have Lightroom. So that's what Lightroom Classic always did, and I just saw it pop over on the iPad, and we go look at the iPad, now it's back to being brighter. So that's what Lightroom Classic is all about. Now, let's go back to the desktop, and if I go over to Lightroom, so here's Lightroom, and in Lightroom, I've got the same album, by the way. If I go down and find it, it's in my TWP folder, and it's the album called Dronography, and there it is. So same images. Now, again, even though I'm in Lightroom on the desktop, which can have full resolution, where did these images come from? They came from Classic in the cloud. Therefore, even in Lightroom on the desktop, these are still smart previews because that's what originally got sunk up to the cloud. Now, if we go look at one of our other newer albums, one of the ones that I shot, like I did live shoots in the Masterclass. Like you might remember this where we're doing a live shoot. I can't remember what the focus of this shoot was. Might have been shooting macro. It might have been just shooting, period. But if we go look at the info for this image here in Lightroom, and we look at the status. So this one says, this is what I was afraid of. This one says Smart Preview only. So that's all that there is here. Smart Preview on the cloud, Smart Preview local. Now let's go look at another one. So I know some of these are going to be the real deal. Hang on, let's go here. Where we did the wine bottle shoot. Let's go look at one of these. Okay, here we go. Cloud, original NEF. So the full resolution from my Nikon Z6, that's what I shot this with, is up in the cloud. What we're currently looking at is the Smart Preview because it's saving space on my hard drive. But if I want to export this or print this or do anything with it, it will use the full resolution. It will sync down the full resolution in that moment for me to use. And there's ways to say keep the full resolution on the drive because I want to always have it, but pretty much that is it. All right, so do you sync it from Lightroom Classic? Do you sync it from, I think you mean or Lightroom. Yes, I do both. It just depends. I have been, for the most part, I would say the majority of my 50,000 images in the cloud are mainly Smart Previews because I work mainly in Classic. But like shoots like this where I did them for the Photography Masterclass, and I shot tethered in Lightroom Classic on a different computer, not my main catalog in Lightroom Classic. Then when I came over and I said, oh, you know, I want to import these into my main catalog, I added them into Lightroom so that I would have the full resolution. So when I did this, I just hit add photos. I went and found the folder that I had shot tethered with in my studio, added these, how many ever photos these are, and then all these original raw files got synced up and backed up. So again, if this hard drive that these are all, or my other ones were on, crashed, I would not lose these because these are in the cloud. These are full resolution in the cloud backed up. All right, Steve says, I remember that shoot. All right, next up. Lightroom Classic can download full resolution raw files from Lightroom, correct, but not the other way around, correct. So what does that mean? That means that, okay, let's think about that for a minute. I had a folder called Wine and Cheese, shot in a different room, different computer, different day. I basically brought that folder into this room. I opened up Lightroom and I added that folder. So that meant they sunk up to the cloud. Now we're out of time too. But if I go back to Lightroom Classic and I go to my demo area quickly, that wine and cheese folder will be in here somewhere. There it is. And those 66 originals are here as well because remember I said originals come down. So you decide where they go, which folder they go into in your preferences, but I am out of time. I'm going to get cut off anyway. So guys, and cheers. Stay tuned for the, hope you got something out of this. Stay tuned for the Photoshop Daily Creative Challenge. Bye everybody.